So the situation in Ukraine is as follows. You have over 870,000 Ukrainians reportedly have fled the country. The Russian military convoy is continuing to snake its way toward Kyiv, the capital city. There are very heightened concerns about a siege of the capital, as well as the escalation of Russian strikes that are hitting civilian targets. And there's even accusations already that the Russians are specifically, in some cases, targeting civilian areas and going after not just critical infrastructure and military, but other civilian targets of opportunity as they see it. We had been wondering when we were going to get an official Russian Ministry of Defense update on casualties. Clay, over the weekend, the numbers we were seeing were in the neighborhood of between 3,000 and 4,000 Russians killed. That seemed too high to me. There's no way the Russian military would be able to sustain 3,000 or 4,000 dead a week for the duration of a conflict that could likely go on for months here. They could handle it by numbers, but not politically at home. Putin would. That's far too many. They lost 15,000 in a decade in Afghanistan, by way of comparison, and we know what a disaster that was for the Soviets. The Russian Defense Ministry has said 498 of its soldiers have been killed in Ukraine, with almost 1,600 wounded. Those numbers do seem pretty close to those are pretty. Now, look, they may be underplaying it, to be sure, but yeah, when you're talking about 1,600 casualties all in, when you're talking killed and wounded as well, killed and wounded together, 2,000 in a week. That then does correspond with what we've seen, which is a lot of footage of these convoys, armored personnel carriers, tanks being hit by Ukrainian resistance. And those Javelin anti-tank missiles and the other armaments that have been sent to the Ukrainians in recent years, notably, I would add, by the Trump administration over the objections of previous Obama administration officials, they're certainly causing serious problems for the Russians. Clay, here's the big question we've got. We don't know which way this is going right now. Is Putin losing fast enough and heavily enough that maybe he is rethinking, or are we still in the early phase of a conflict that is just about to ramp up dramatically, and therefore the Ukrainian casualties will get much higher, and Putin is in this for the long run no matter what the costs look like in this early stage? I'm hearing people go back and forth on this. Obviously, tremendously different outcomes depending on which one of those is the likelier scenario. And I've got to say, I tend to think that the Russians have been underestimated up to this point in terms of their dedication to the conquest of at least eastern Ukraine. That's my sense. But the Ukrainians are clearly putting up a really serious fight. Over 2,000 casualties for the Russians. That's a lot.
No doubt. And if the Russians are admitting that, it's probably likely that that's the low end, right? The Ukrainian number probably the high end. The truth probably somewhere in the middle. But that is a substantial loss of manpower. And the question that really begs to be asked is, what is Vladimir Putin's endgame here? Because let's presume that if he continues to push his forces into Ukraine, at some point you would think the raw numbers would lead to his being able to seize Kiev and these other cities that he's attempting to take control of. But what does control look like? Ukraine is the size of Texas. So is Putin going to commit 150,000 troops long range in order to basically be policing all of Ukraine to ensure that whatever government he tries to prop up is going to be in power there? And then what sort of long-term consequences is he willing to accept in terms of the cost of that occupation? And also, Buck, the cost of that occupation plus the loss of men and materials that will continue, because I think you're going to continue to see Ukrainian citizens firing away pot shots here and there, taking out troops, throwing Molotov cocktails, ending lives and ending the use of so many different apparatus of war there. So how does this end for Putin in any way other than a loss? Because that's the way I'm already looking ahead for. is there are many ways this thing could end. Russia could decide, hey, you know, it's not worth it. We're going to end up some sort of negotiated settlement, claim that we got what we wanted, and pull out. But it doesn't seem to me, Buck, like this has any possibility of ending in a positive direction for Vladimir Putin. The question is just what's the time frame?
So here's what I think, and this goes into the analytic prediction category, right? Here's what I think Putin is trying to get out of this. And I'm the first to admit that there's a lot of conflicting reporting about everything right now. The Russian morale for the troops is super low. The Russians have barely begun to fight. The Ukrainians feel like they can keep this going for months. The Ukrainians feel like once the artillery comes in and close air support from the Russians are pounding them, it's just a matter of days before they have to capitulate. So you're seeing reporting and debates about the reporting on both sides of these major equations. Here's what I think is happening, or rather, here's what I think Putin wants to happen. I'd say that. This is his endgame as I see it, and I could be wrong, and we'll see, but he's going to encircle Kyiv. That's obviously underway right now. He's going to encircle Kyiv, be pounding the capital city, and they're going to be turning up the pressure, and they'll be mounting casualties and also destruction of critical infrastructure and military and security units in the rest of Ukraine going on. So they'll be strengthening the Russian bargaining position. The eastern part of Ukraine, for all intents and purposes in Putin's mind, the Donbas region, is Russia. That is now the Russian Federation. Russian passports have been given out. No way. That's why he said from the very beginning he's recognizing them as independent states or recognizing their independence. They're part of Russia. In any negotiation, I think that will be immovable for Vladimir Putin. The part of Ukraine from essentially the capital east of the Dnieper River, that I think is going to become a Russian peacekeeping, quote-unquote peacekeeping or protectorate zone. They'll keep military there. They'll say, in order to protect Russian-speaking minorities and for stabilization during the ceasefires and negotiations that will be happening around the capital city. I think they want the government under Zelensky to effectively capitulate to full Russian control of the Donbas, a Russian buffer state, if you will, or buffer zone in the east of the Dnieper River area in Ukraine, and then essentially the concession will be the end of open hostilities and warfare, with the end of the invasion, effectively, and they'll give the western part of Ukraine to some sort of a power sharing, or they'll break that down and say, well, that can effectively be what the old Ukraine was at some level with this new government going on, right? That's how I see it happening, because I don't believe that Putin thinks he can expand all across the entire country and maintain that. But what he does have here is there's Ukrainian-speaking Ukrainians and Russian-speaking Ukrainians in his mind. And if he can separate those out geographically and in terms of a political notion as well, it's effectively a divide and conquer strategy in stages, Clay. That's what I think he's going to do instead of going for the whole country. If he can get there militarily, which is the huge unanswered question that I don't know how that goes.
I think the other question that a lot of people are debating, and we should talk about this when we come back in the next segment, how does Zelinski play into this? Because you know the way that people respond to issues like these, Buck, is they become attached to stories, and they become attached to the individual story. And Zelinski has become a hero of much of the Western world and, frankly, of much of the world in general. How does Putin finesse that? Because it doesn't seem like Zelensky is going to walk away from Ukraine, even if his life remains, as it is so far, in incredible danger. And what is Russia going to do with him? How do they reconcile the immense amount of political legitimacy that Zelensky is going to retain no matter what? To me, that's one of the big topics of discussion here, because it goes to what Russia will be able to do even if they, quote unquote, win this war in some way, which I think certainly there's a big debate about whether that's going to happen or not. So, Buck, as we went to break there, I was talking about, to a large extent, the Russia versus Ukraine battle has been distilled down to Vladimir Zelensky against Vladimir Putin, right? Zelensky is the upstart underdog hero of democracy, as it were, in the way that this story is being conveyed. And Putin is the archangel of modern day death and autocracy, and certainly is being compared to Adolf Hitler in many stretches of the world. Okay, so the question that is out there: how does this resolve itself as it pertains to Zelensky? Because the truth of the matter is this: as long as Zelensky is alive, then there is a tremendous heartbeat of democracy that will continue to extend with him. But if Russia is able to get him and kill him, it's crude, but this is the reality, then that heartbeat of democracy is potentially challenged. Now, simultaneously, however, if Zelensky is captured and killed, then he becomes a martyr, and there is an argument that he might become even more powerful for the Ukrainian people in death than he did in life. And certainly it will mobilize even more anger against Vladimir Putin in the nation and in the world as a whole, because many of us are seeing Zelensky as the personification of the Ukrainian resistance. So, Buck, how does this play out as it pertains in your mind to Zelensky himself? Is it smarter for him to flee and keep his life even as Ukraine falls? Is it better for him to stay there and fight to the bitter end? And how does Russia handle it? This is a big part of the story.
It's better for Ukraine, for the resistance against this Russian aggression, for him to stay. I think that's pretty clear. It's obviously much higher risk for Zelensky personally. And this is a fascinating question, because you can see both sides of this. And I think that's so important too. There's a lot of people that are running around analyzing this stateside, projecting certainty. And I'm telling you right now, I was analyzing two wars for years. People who tell you they're certain tend to be wrong a lot. And on this issue of Putin and his mindset, on the one hand, you know that there was the poisoning, as we mentioned, of, I believe it was Viktor Yushchenko.
Yes.
The Ukrainian premier, over a decade ago now, with dioxin, which is why you see it horribly scarred his face. I mean, looked like a different person afterwards. That was meant to send a message. This is how the Russians do things. Same thing with the polonium poisoning of the Russian defector in the UK. Put radioactive isotopes inside him to erode him from the inside out. I mean, it's horrible. They do this to send a message. So that's extreme cruelty on display from the Russians, but with a degree of plausible deniability. Whether we think it's plausible or not, they'll say, oh, that wasn't, in the case of the poisoning, for example, that would be the Russian external intelligence operations of the SVR. The FSB is the domestic, think of it more like their version of the FBI on steroids. The SVR is more like their version of the CIA, or same thing in the UK. There's MI5 for domestic intelligence, MI6 for external foreign intelligence. So they had some level of plausible deniability. If they kill Zelensky, everybody knows that they've killed Zelensky, which brings me to my other point, Clay, which I think you're getting to. What does this mean in the long term? The Russians want what they want in Ukraine while also being able to re-enter, sure, as a state that a lot of people view negatively, but the Russian government's going to want to be at the UN and, going forward at some point, go back into the international community, whether people like it or not. They're not going to accept being a total pariah state like, say, North Korea. Now, their energy reserves is why that's a lot harder. I do think, though, there's a line at which Putin realizes, if you're assassinating effectively a foreign head of state, people are going to remember that. If you're killing large numbers of Ukrainian civilians, people are going to remember that past even the duration of the conflict. So, I don't have a clear answer on it, other than I think there are conflicting forces here. With Putin is vicious in ways that we've all seen on the world stage before and are seeing it now, but also he doesn't want to be turned into Gaddafi, as we know.
There are so many different directions this can go, Buck. And I think what you said is people who claim that they know certainty or have certitude as to how this plays out are missing so many of the different objectives at play, and so many, frankly, of the fine lines between the direction this can head. But I think Zelensky has become the focal point for many people all around the world as the personification of the battle that Ukraine is waging.
Clay, this is part of last night's State of the Union address. I think the analysis of it has to be, when we're looking at the situation in Ukraine, how much of the Biden administration's posturing up to this point is driven by principles and human rights concerns, and how much of the decision making is really being pushed by the fact that we have a high energy prices already in this country. It's easier to talk tough on this than it is to take, even, I'm talking purely economic front right now for everybody. We're not even discussing for the time being. We will, but we're not even discussing in this moment of the conversation military action on behalf of the Ukrainians against the Russians. I think there's still enough of an understanding that is going near absolute catastrophe. That is going right up to the of the abyss. So here, for example, when Biden was talking about all of this last night, Clay, it seems to me that there's a recognition that the American people will not go all the way on this issue, and that's why you've got a high chance, I'd say, a high chance that we try to stay where we are for some period of time here. We try to stay at this level of involvement. What do you think, though, would turn the corner on this? What would change the sense of what Biden and the administration are willing to do from a U.S. perspective in Ukraine?
I think the challenge that is so profound here is we have allowed Russian oil and gas industries to become so incredibly powerful. I was reading this morning the Wall Street Journal editorial page and don't miss what's going on here. As there has become this climate sensitivity, this Green New Deal, this America and the world is going to cease to exist because of global warming, there has been a decision to downgrade our own production of oil and gas. And the same thing has happened simultaneously in Europe. And don't mistake what's occurring when that happens. Oil and gas demand is not disappearing. When we decide to ratchet back our production of oil and gas, we are allowing the Vladimir Putins of the world, the Mideast authoritarians of the world to have more power. So this, to me, is a calculated example of how our misguided, in my opinion, focus on global warming and climate change and everything else is destroying our ability to create energy independence for ourselves. And the absence of us producing that oil and gas, that energy production, allows these autocrats, these communist dictators, these people who are frankly not in alliance with American values or in global democracy to rise up and grab more power. And that's the underlying story here, Buck. And the reality is, are we willing, and I think it's such an interesting question, are we willing to bear the increased cost of actually sanctioning Russia such that their oil and gas is not distributed to Europe and is not distributed to the United States? And we might have to pay, let's be honest, $1 more a gallon for gas. That's the reality. Or are we going to say, oh, we're happy going in 1 foot instead of both feet into this sanctioned world?
Here's Representative Steve Scalise, who's saying that Biden needs to stop financing Putin's war.
Yeah. President Biden needs to stop financing Putin's war with Russian oil because he shut off the spigots of American energy. It's having devastating impacts on the people of Ukraine, but it's putting billions of dollars in Putin's pocket. Think about the number again, $700 million a day between the United States, European Union, and UK are going to Russia every single day. President Biden, these failed energy policies are having devastating impacts on Americans, but also on the people of Ukraine because those policies are financing the war.
Climate change ideology comes with very high costs, and I don't even just mean the financial costs of driving up the price of energy and making it more difficult to get leases on federal land and shutting down pipelines. And we know about that. We have to keep hammering it. But also, Clay, when you think about it, but to the point you were just making, what are some of the countries in the world that are the worst actors on a global scale? They're often countries that have been essentially economically one-trick ponies, right? Russia is the biggest one that comes to mind. Saudi Arabia got away with a lot for a long time because of its oil reserves and still does to this day. Venezuela obviously was funding its insane. Venezuela ran an experiment. If we have a lot of free money in the ground and we take a more Marxist approach, can we ruin an economy that's basically sitting on a giant ATM machine? The answer is yes. Socialism can even ruin that. largest proven oil reserves in the world is actually Venezuela, not Saudi Arabia. So keep that in mind when you see that people are on the quote Maduro diet there of essentially slow starvation because they can't get food. We know that a lot of the bad actors on the world stage rely on fossil fuels to prop up their regime, to pay for their militaries. So when gas prices are high, those places become more belligerent. They become more willing to take risks, including what we're seeing right now in Russia. And even if you want to be somebody who thinks, oh, climate change, we have to take this more seriously, the only adult way to try to limit CO2 emissions in a meaningful way is nuclear power, which European countries, particularly France, are ahead of the U.S. on because they haven't had some of the same environmentalist wackos calling the shots over there that they have here. But nuclear power, it's not windmills. So, I mean, not only is the climate change catastrophe theory, I think, just wrong on the merits, and in 10 years they'll be saying, oh, we only have 10 years, and in 10 years after that, we know that they've done this before. Go back and watch the Al Gore movie, An Inconvenient Truth. Put that aside. If they were serious about it, we'd be talking about nuclear, and these decisions have massive national security implications for us and all over the world.
No doubt. And the fact that we're not willing to have those conversations in a detailed fashion. Oh, it's great for you to change your social media profile picture to the Ukrainian flag. But ultimately, there are hard choices that are required. And you have to balance what you may want to do if you are a Democrat when it comes to the Green New Deal and it comes to climate change and energy spending. And the reality that those choices that we make in this country and that Europe is making are enabling and empowering places like Russia. And if we're not willing to cut off the oil and gas spigot from Russia, then frankly, we aren't going to be able to destroy the economy of Russia. We're just not, because they're still going to be bringing in at least half of their overall resources in that respect.
And just keep in mind, they're assuming, for everyone out there, they're assuming that all the economic actions we've taken against them. I mean, look at, we haven't normalized relations with Iran, since 1979, right? I mean, we haven't had diplomatic relations with Iran for decades now. The Russians are assuming that when this is done, there will be normal diplomatic, just because of how important their energy and just geographically and from a national security perspective, the Russians think they're too big to isolate over the long term.
Too big to fail.
That's
too
right.
Big
too
to
big to fail. And so in the short term, they're willing to take a lot of pain, and they're willing. And when I say they, I'm talking about the Russian leadership, not the Russian people, who clearly are going to suffer a lot from all of this and with no actual say in the discussion. To that end, we should talk a little bit about some of these efforts to take action against Russians in weird ways all over the world. People pouring out their vodka and this stuff. I mean, I remember the Freedom Fries moment in 2003 where we weren't supposed to say French fries. And that was just because the French premier was not willing. What was it? Jacques Chirac was not willing to go along with us in the coalition of the willing. So now it was supposed to be Freedom Fries. There were people who were actually boycotting French restaurants in New York City. This actually happened, only to find out that it was owned by an American and it was all employed. They just were serving French cuisine.
Yes.
So we gotta also maintain a degree of seriousness about actions that are going to be taken here in the homeland with regard to the situation in Ukraine. I saw a lot of flag pins and such last night at the stadium. I mean, that's fine, but Ukrainian flag pin, no U.S. flag pin, member of Congress. I think that's, people might say,
How about, do you think people would wear Taiwan flags if China invaded?
Even better question. No, I don't actually. I think a lot of people would be too scared to do that among our elites and among the apparatus in this country.